Throughout history, mankind has always found creative ways for meting out justice to perceived wrongs. Now, whether or not those punishments are too gruesome for their crimes is another argument entirely. In our modern world, besides the perhaps extreme death penalty, punishments for crime are much less gory than they were in the past. So, your speeding ticket might be the height of state oppression to you, but the ancients had different ideas of how to combat misdemeanor. In the next few minutes, we'll be talking about the most grievous and unimaginable punishments that have found themselves in the pages of history. Crushing by elephant. When it came to torture, humans have used anything they could lay their hands on to ensure their victims endure extreme pain. While the Romans used lions and bears, in ancient India and parts of Southeast Asia, elephants were the executioners. Elephants were a symbol of authority, so monarchs trained them to be used as instruments of state power. The elephants would crush, dismember, or torture prisoners in a public execution. They were always under the control of a driver who could end or extend the process to meet the ruler's interests. Persons who were subjected to this form of punishment were enemy soldiers or civilians who were guilty of crimes like theft and tax evasion. The Brazen Bowl. This was practiced in ancient Greece. Developed in Sicily, it was also referred to as the Sicilian Bowl. The Brazen Bowl was an actual object made of bronze and in the form of a bowl. The condemned person was usually placed within the bowl and a fire would be lit beneath it. This caused the bronze to heat until the person inside was burnt to death alive. Another horrific fact was that the Brazen Bowl had pipes in it, which turned the condemned person's screams of pain into the bellows of a bull. Flaying. Flaying, or skinning, is mostly associated with dead animals in order to get their skin for leather and other purposes. However, in the early times, flaying was applied as a punishment. It involved removing the skin of the condemned as a whole while he was still alive. Depending on the extent of skin removed, the condemned ended up dying or having psychological issues. The cause of death was usually due to extreme blood loss. The punishment was applied in the Ottoman Empire, medieval England, and ancient Rome for centuries. It was particularly practiced by the kings of the Assyrian Empire between 911 and 609 BC. These kings applied the punishment on their enemies, especially those who led rebellions. To them, the punishment symbolized subjugating an enemy. Burning at the stake. Perhaps being famous for the execution of supposed witches in Europe, this agonizing experience originated in Babylonia before gaining popularity in Europe during the Middle Ages. Here, the accused person would be bound to a stake and burned alive until they stopped screaming. In some cases, the authorities had mercy on the victim by attaching a container of gunpowder to them. This would explode when heated by the fire, killing the person faster. Another way of showing mercy was by placing the victim in a chain noose and killing them by hanging before the fire caused much harm. Punishment by the rack. The rack was a widely known torture device made in the form of a wooden rectangular frame. The limbs of the condemned person would be attached to the four sides of the frame. With the aids of rollers and pulleys, the person's limbs would then be stretched until they were torn from the body. Impalement. Impalement was a form of unimaginable and prolonged torture which preceded death. Usually a hook, pole, stake, or spear would be sharpened and driven into the ground, with the sharp point facing the sky. The condemned person would then be placed over the instrument and pierced through the vagina if they were a woman, or the rectum of a man. The sharpened tool would force itself into the victim's insides and often come out through their throat, neck, or shoulders. Some poles were blunted on purpose in order to prolong the torture, which could last for hours and even days. It was not just common but was also popular in the Middle Ages. The punishment was mostly reserved for persons convicted of treason or crimes against the state. The waist chop. Do you think you've heard the worst of the punishments? Wait till you hear this. As a form of punishment, the waist chop was applied by using an extremely large-bladed instrument to slice a prisoner into two. This was done at the waist, thus missing essential organs. The result was a slow and very painful death. The waist chop was practiced in China and was only abolished in the 18th century. The Ling Kai, also called death by 1,000 cuts or slow slicing. This punishment was also common in China. Here, the condemned would be tied to a post while his limbs and skin were slowly removed one after the other, until his head or heart was cut off. It was practiced in the 10th century, was in vogue for about 1,000 years, and was banned in 1905. Keel hauling. Keel hauling was a torture method specifically reserved for sailors at sea because it had to be done on a moving ship. When a sailor was keel hauled, the goal was either to kill him by extreme torture or just to make him endure extreme pain and possibly be maimed. The sailor would be tied to the ship's mast and a weight would be attached to his legs. The torture begins when the crew lets the sailor fall to the sea, and because of the rope, he is dragged along the keel of the ship. This treatment was particularly horrible because the bottom of the ship is covered in barnacles and other organisms that would keep lacerating the victim's body as the ship moved. Boiling to death. Boiling a person alive has to be the most terrifying thing ever. Popular in East Asia and England many centuries ago, boiling was done in two ways. The first way was by stripping the condemned naked and placing him in a pot of boiling liquid, which could either be oil, tar, or water. The other way was by putting the person in a cool liquid, which would then be heated, causing the liquid to rise in temperature gradually. Historical records from Henry VIII's reign, a former king of England, show that some individuals were boiled for about 2 hours before they finally gave up the ghost. The penalty of the sack. This punishment was also called poena colae. It was popular in ancient Rome as a form of punishing people guilty of parricide, that is, the murder of one's parents or closely knitted family member. The penalty of the sack was carried out by the condemned person being flogged and then put into a large sack, after which the sack was sealed and thrown into a body of water. But that wasn't all. The hardest part about this punishment was that the person was put in the sack with animals such as an ape, chicken, dog, or snake. While drowning, the person will also be viciously attacked by the animals till they all eventually die. Death by rats. Perhaps not so historical, the use of rats to kill has been employed by 20th century South American military dictators. It entails a rat being put inside a cage. The opposite side of the bottomless cage would then be heated, and the cage placed on the condemned person's body, most often the torso. Having discovered that the way out has been blocked by fire, the rat would slowly chew the victim's flesh in order to carve another way out for itself. Do not try this at home. The boat, also known as scaphism. The boat, another terrible form of punishment, began with taking the individual to a body of water and putting him inside a boat. Another boat was then placed on top of the first one and sealed to it. This formed a kind of shell, with the subject's head, arms, and legs sticking out of the side openings. Afterwards, his arms, face, and legs would be covered with milk and honey and placed under the sun or near a body of water. The milk and honey usually attracted flies and bugs. The condemned soul would also be forced to eat the milk and honey. This doesn't sound like a form of punishment, but the diet actually caused diarrhea. Vermin would be attracted to the feces, feed on it, enter the man's body, and devour it. Well, those are only some of the unspeakable punishments carried out throughout history. Oof, we better be grateful for that fine or a comfy prison bunk bed.